The course delivery ended up moving all over the board throughout the spring and into the fall, and then finally settled, with about 2/3 of universities offering courses either largely online or in a hybrid format, with another quarter of the universities having their courses being offered either completely in person or substantially in person. The original plans were for it to be a little bit tilted the other way, but they ended up in those percentages. What I can tell you, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, is it had no impact on the student housing market, the format of course delivery. In terms of housing on campuses, most universities de-densified their housing. They reduced the number of students living on campus, and they did that by either reducing double and triple occupancy dorm rooms down to single occupancy dorm rooms, or in some instances, shuttering the residence halls altogether, or at least some of the buildings. The result was the average university had somewhere between 25 and 50% fewer students living on campus this year than they did last year. University enrollments. If you look at it at the 30,000 foot level, they were down 2.5% during this pandemic year. But don't look at that number, because that's not the relevant number. That's all of higher education. The relevant number for student housing is four-year public universities. And at four-year publics, enrollment was flat. Now, there were some nuances. The freshman class was down 10.5%. Some decided to stay at home or to not enroll this year. 10.5% fewer freshmen this year during the pandemic. The flip side is universities are recession resistant, and last spring's graduates had difficulty getting jobs during the pandemic. So what went up? What went up was graduate enrollments. They were up 3.6%. And the other sector that was obviously impacted with student visa issues and with travel restrictions were international students, where undergraduate student enrollments for international students were down 15% and graduate enrollments down 8%. But also remember, as valuable as they are to the educational experience, international students are only 5% of those studying in America. Student housing in the pandemic year performed fantastically. It demonstrated once again that it's a recession-resistant asset class, and it also has now shown it's a pandemic-resistant asset class. Let's look at a few of those metrics. First, fall occupancy. Fall occupancy was down 3%, but many would have expected it to be down much more with a decline in the freshman class and students being online. They would have thought that number would have been more dramatic. It was not. The kids still wanted to be at school. Then let's look at the next metric, which is the show-up rate. Students sign leases, pre-leases, all year long, and then are looked to show up in August. And on a typical year, the industry ends up with somewhere between 0.5% and 1% of all those pre-leases that don't show. Maybe they flunked out of school, maybe they're taking a gap year, maybe there's issues at home. 0.5% to 1% in a normal year don't show. It's a relatively small percentage. This year, in our portfolio, 0.5% didn't show up. And we backfilled all of those in the coming months thereafter. So we saw no impact whatsoever in the number of students that signed pre-leases and showed up during the pandemic than we did during a normal student housing cycle. Let's look also into the spring. Normally, there's not a big pickup in occupancy from fall to spring. Students get their accommodations for the entire academic year, and they're all signed up. Well, this year, because students, some of them stayed at home, those students started getting sick of being at home and were dribbling back to college, such that with our portfolio, between the fall in the spring, we picked up an entire occupancy point of students coming back, most noticeably at universities that had really conservative messaging. They were sending the students home and telling them stay at home. And then they decided they didn't want to stay at home, irrespective of the university's messaging, and they came back to campus to live in off-campus apartments. And finally, collections. That is a really important metric of performance. And collections this far in student housing, our portfolio, 98% average collections so far during this academic year. Compare that for the same months to conventional multifamily, 94%. So student housing outperforming multifamily by 4% in collections. And interestingly, compare 2020 to 2019, pandemic versus pre-pandemic, same collections. 98% this year, 98% last year, shows the value of a parental guarantee backing your lease obligation. So let's look at university outlook for next year. Let's start with course delivery, and it basically is the exact opposite of fall of 2020. That universities are largely planning to be either substantially in person or entirely in person, and they're coming out early with that messaging. And of particular note is those universities who were the most conservative this year are the first ones out of the gate telling their students next year you're going to be back in person. That includes the California State University system, the University of California system, and even Princeton University have all come out and said it will be in person next fall. That is the national trend. It's going that way super overwhelmingly that students are going to be back in person next fall. On-campus housing is going to increase its density and increase the number of students coming back to campus as well. I don't expect it's going to come all the way back to pre-pandemic levels this coming fall. That'll take a couple of years, but it certainly is going to be an increase in the number of students living on campus, and in particular, pretty much the entire freshman class. Now let's talk about enrollment for next year. Now, enrollment may be one of the strongest single-year enrollment growths we've seen in a decade or more. Why? It's because the freshman class last year, many of them, we had mentioned 10.5% lower enrollment with freshmen last year. Those freshmen have either deferred or didn't choose to enroll, and they're coming back this year. At the same point in time, you have the entire graduating high school class who's college-bound as well. And those students had to live at home and take online courses their entire senior year. They do not want to miss out on college. They're coming this fall. So universities will have a choice with essentially a potential double-sized freshman class, or at least an expanded freshman class, can drive enrollment growth as well. We'll also see continued challenges with employment. So you'll see graduate enrollments, strong enrollment growth there. And the question on international student enrollment will have to do with what's the backlog of the time to get your visa to get here in time for the fall semester, and are there any remaining travel restrictions? So I think you're going to find with some countries that's going to be better. Our embassies are generally open, but they got a long backlog, so we'll see more international students this year, but it won't quite return to the pre-pandemic levels. But it will someday within a couple of years. But this year it will still be higher. So off-campus student housing, two things. First of all, the pre-leasing at this stage in the cycle, here in early April, the pre-leasing is behind last year, about 10% nationwide. And you shouldn't be surprised. At this point last year, they had just barely declared the pandemic. So all that pre-leasing was in a pre-pandemic era. Whereas this year, it's in the middle of the pandemic. So what you're seeing is a deferral of the leasing decision and not a change, in our opinion, of the leasing decision. We believe at the end of the summer, when the leasing cycle is done, not only will we catch up, but we will surpass the enrollment this year, the occupancy this year, and the pre-leasing for this year. The future of higher education, how has the pandemic changed that? That's a really intriguing and interesting question. The one thing in the rearview mirror we can look at and know is that higher education pivoted at light speed to go from in-person to completely online in the spring. Secondly, what they've done is they've got better at online education, exploring with hybrid formats, having half the class in one day and half the class remote, and other mediums of course delivery. Is that going to change the future outlook for higher education and course delivery? My response would be twofold. That number one, for the traditional 18 to 22-year-old residential student coming out of high school, it's not going to change. They want a residential campus, they want to live at college, they want to build friendships, they want the whole college experience. And frankly, they don't, as much as they spend a lot of time on social media, they do not like online course delivery. It's an inferior method of delivering education, and they don't like it. So that, in my opinion, is not going to change. What probably will change is the lifelong learner. Certain graduate programs, especially working graduate students, who it would be much more convenient to take their courses online at night than driving to a campus at night, and they're not getting a campus experience beyond taking the class. So as such, I think graduate delivery and the format of graduate delivery may change significantly going forward, but it's not going to change the undergraduate experience in a measurable way. Student housing investment looking forward. Whether you like it or not, we're in the middle of a recession, and student housing again has proven to be recession resistant. And I believe going forward, showing that it's pandemic resistant, that it is recession resistant, that the value of parental guarantees in collecting your rents are all reinforcing the basic investment principles and the value of student housing. So what you will see is wise institutional investors will allocate a portion of their asset allocation into this recession-resistant asset class. It will perform well on a portfolio approach to make sure you've got part of your portfolio in student housing along with all of your other real estate asset classes. A really bright outlook for student housing having been proven through this pandemic.